When the sun is high in the middle of summer, it's a great time to do some shadow tracing. Shadow tracing was probably one of the first forms of human artistic expression. It's even possible it contributed to the birth of modern drawing and painting itself. You don't have to get fancy to have some fun with this technique. Just some white paper, good shadows, and a pencil will do the trick. It's incredibly satisfying to quickly trace the shadows and get instant gratification on the page. It's a technique that forces you to work fast and loose. You can actually notice the shadows moving if you spend more than about 10 minutes on one piece. I thought that the shadow tracing technique would work really well with a wet-on-wet watercolor technique, so I soaked up some paper and tried it out. I immediately got distracted by the lovely dappled light streaming through the kiwi vines. I'm temporarily set up in this outdoor studio space, and it's providing all sorts of different kinds of inspiration. I was just using what I had on hand that afternoon, which happened to be a Beam Paints sample card and some admittedly crappy paintbrushes from a sample pack. I was using basic student-grade watercolor paper, and it all was just in the same spirit of working fast and loose and being non-precious with my materials. So I've got very wet, sloppy paint, and I've got a jar of water right beside me to keep everything quite moist as I'm working, because I'm trying to capture that kind of soft, edged, dappled light. This was a fun creative exercise, and I think it would be a really cool background to work on top of. I'll definitely do it again. Okay, I got that out of my system, and now it's time to try tracing some leaves. I put my damp watercolor paper on a damp piece of cloth. Do yourself a favor, put on some sunscreen, and wear sunglasses. You're staring at a bright white piece of paper. The keen-eyed among you will have spotted the problem right away. My hand is blocking the shadows from this angle. It wasn't the end of the world, but you can see my awkward hand movements trying to get out of my own way. Once again, I've got a jar of water beside me, and I'm keeping the paint really wet and sloppy. It also helps if you have a little spray bottle. If your paper dries out too much, just give it a spray. I used a dry cloth and my fingertip to press down on areas of the paint in order to lift it off and show more of the white paper underneath. And here it is dry. I think it definitely captures a little bit of that dappled light vibe. I found myself walking all over the garden, shoving white pieces of paper under any shadow that I could find. It's really fun to see how moving the paper further or closer to the source affects the image. And I finally figured out that if I start painting from behind the image, my shadow won't block the plant's shadow. I started another one with a lovely mint silhouette. As the paper gets half dry, I can load my paintbrush up and get more precise with my brush strokes. This will create a more defined hard edge on top of the soft, blurry background. Working upside down also helps to get out of your own way mentally. Some of you might remember this as a technique from the book Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain by Betty Edwards. Another happy accident with this technique is I can just move the paper around and create my own composition. I'll admit this was not a great composition. It's basically just a giant X on the page. But there's parts of this painting that I really like, not least of which is the loose and flowy nature of the whole thing. But I really like the combination of the sharp edges on top of the blurry background. This may look like a hot mess to some people, and that's fine. This technique isn't for everyone. But I like how it creates an impression of the plant as opposed to a botanical illustration. I'd like to try this technique again with more subdued colors in the background and perhaps adding a more detailed pen and ink layer on top. So there you have it, shadow tracing. Give it a go. You might surprise yourself.